horrors of the war have been kept from, most Russians, and certainly most of those in Moscow. And it's been a surprise to all of us that, all those political and news shows that we see sort of edited and put out on social media all the time, of how wonderful Putin is and how brilliant the Russian military are. In the last week or so, people are starting to question, what's gone wrong, what's happening, and of course, Kursk itself has, it's part of the Russian DNA. I mean, you've mentioned that the first time Russia has been invaded since the Second World War, but the Battle of Kursk, which was the graveyard for hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers, and is so key to the Russian psyche because it was their big sort of defeat of the Nazi Germany. To now see it, almost upturned, people can't believe it. And 200,000 refugees who've been kicked out of their homes, and they've been fed on this diet of Putin being this brilliant military strategist. Now people are realizing that is just not the case. And, there's now talk of another mobilization. Hitherto, the Russian army has been pretty much full of ethnic Russians from the East and prisoners. I mean, there's some prisoners who've been in and out of jail so often and back to the front. If it wasn't so flipping terrible, it would be comical. And the thought now, the last time they had a mobilization just after the start of the war, hundreds of, or not tens of thousands of Russian men, fled the country. So that's why I think, Russia is in a really difficult position, a really, as far as we're concerned, a good position. I think Putin is absolutely rattled and clinging on, and people who don't really understand these things will be saying, oh, well, whoever replaces him is going to be much worse. Well, he might be, but he's not going to have an army to threaten, NATO for the next 10 years or so. So why should we worry about that? Which is why it's so important that absolutely, we stop rabbit punching around and get in for the killer blow, which is why, the British Storm Shadow is so important. It might only be one missile, but it has a strategic impact. And I hope that Sir Keir Starmer and his team are getting to understand that and are being briefed on that particular thing. So, yeah, I think the Russian army is absolutely stretched to the limits. People in Russia are beginning to realize the myth of the great leader is a complete myth, and realize that they are absolutely suffering. And exactly as you say, Russian soldiers are getting looked after rather than the other way around, where they're getting starved. And there's some horrific pictures of Ukrainian soldiers being beheaded by their captors and their heads put on stakes. Now, whether that might well be propaganda, but that is the feeling that one gets. So anything we can do to personify that and make sure that people in Russia understand it, the better, because ultimately everybody wants peace as soon as possible.
Just a couple of quick questions to finish off, Hamish. First of all, we should just touch on events in the east of Ukraine. There is some evidence, according to the Institute for the Study of War, of Russia now diverting troops away from the east to go and fight in the Kursk region or around the Kursk region. But they are still making, it appears, incremental gains on Pokrovsk. What is your reading of what's happening there?
Well, that's true. And I think with all these things, one can get very focused in a particular area. And we've been very focused on Kursk. And as you say, down in the Donbass, the Russians are making incremental gains. But, we are talking meters rather than kilometers. I also think, and I think I'm not the only one, that I am not sure that the Kursk maneuver is the only one that the Ukrainians are planning. And if I was a brilliant general commanding this, I would certainly have something else.
You think they'll have more incursions to come?
I wouldn't be at all surprised if there is another thrust somewhere else, because, almost in a sort of slapstick comedy, as all the Russians start streaming towards, the northeast, suddenly they're going to be pedaling in sort of clear air, as it were, as something happens behind them. So, and I think, again, it might well be just very smart counterintelligence and propaganda by the Ukrainians. There is a feel that there is another incursion like Kursk to come somewhere else on the line. And that would make absolute sense to me, because, we are talking about a few thousand soldiers and a few hundred tanks and vehicles that are made the Kursk operation. Now, we know that the Ukrainian army is, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and we know that they've got hundreds, if not thousands, of tanks and armored vehicles. Sure, a lot of them are on the front lines, but if the Ukrainians are as smart as they've shown in the Kursk maneuver, they will be planning and getting ready to execute elsewhere as well. I would be pretty certain.
That's really interesting. And that just leads me on to my final question, which is, for how long do you think Ukraine will be able to maintain their position in Kursk? For how long will they want to? Maybe if they're going to launch other incursions, they do a tactical withdrawal and then launch a fresh incursion. And if so, when might that happen?
Well, that is the multi-billion-dollar question. And the fact that people like me and you probably can't give a definitive answer is exactly what the Ukrainians want. Because if we don't know, the Russians certainly won't know. But I would say, that their activities, their strategic activities in Kursk with dropping bridges and also, attacking lines of communications, gets you to think that actually they're not going to, go head west in a couple of days. They're going to head there, and of course, if they give up all that territory that they've gained, they won't be able to negotiate with it. So I think, and the fact that the Russians haven't been able to dislodge them, in over 2 weeks, and it's always easiest to counterattack the minute you've lost some ground. I think they would be reasonably confident to hang around. And if Britain allows them to use Storm Shadow, and the French similar, and the American extend the use of some of the longer range ATACMS missiles, again, it really puts it in back. Keeps the advantage to Ukraine. Because I don't think the Russians can do very much. They're not. They can't combined arms maneuver. Of course, they've got long range weaponry, but they're using that. They're covered. They are showing everything in the window. They are showing and using. And I don't think there's an awful lot there. And absolutely, it might well be that while we're chatting and all looking at Kursk, something else is about to happen. So, I mean, it's sometimes difficult to really work out the wheat from the chaff from all the stuff that's happening on social media. And I think a lot of the stuff about Storm Shadow and Britain not being able to use it because the Americans have said no. I wouldn't be at all surprised if a lot of that stuff is actually coming out of Kremlin propagandists and disinformation, because I don't think the Americans can stop us using it, but virtually every other tweet you see saying the Americans are saying that, and they're saying not. So it's quite difficult to work out who are the Russian propagandists and disinformers and who's not. They all seem to have English names, but so I think a little bit of confusion. But the fact that Ukraine has demonstrated some really effective combined arms maneuver that seems to be way beyond the Russians at the moment. The fact that Putin is really rattled and people in Russia seem to be really rattled. I think it's a great opportunity. And, I really implore our government and leaders to be bold and push home this advantage. And let's not, grab defeat from the jaws of victory in this particular circumstance.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.